A black pilot denied his seat until 3 words changed everything. Elijah Cole was just another passenger that day, ready to head home after 6 grueling days in the air. He wasn't wearing his uniform. No captain's stripes. Just jeans and an old sweater his daughter had given him. But as he stepped onto the plane, something shifted. The smiles from the crew tightened. The flight attendant's eyes lingered on him a second too long. And then, just as he settled into his first-class seat, she appeared beside him. "Excuse me, sir. I need to verify your seat." What happened next? It took just 7 minutes. By the end of it, Elijah's 3 whispered words left the entire crew speechless. And what followed sparked a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from today. If this resonates with you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that shine a light on what too often goes unseen. It started like any ordinary flight. But by the time the wheels touched down, everything had changed. The airport, like any other, was a stage. Travelers played their parts with the usual scripts, boarding passes clutched tightly, carry-ons trailing behind them like afterthoughts. There was comfort in the familiarity of it all. Elijah Cole had been in airports more times than he could count. 23 years in the cockpit did that to a man. But today, he wasn't in uniform. Today, he was just a man with a ticket to seat 2A. And that was enough to change everything. The line for first-class boarding moved briskly. Travelers accustomed to the rhythm. Elijah stood quietly, jeans comfortable against his legs, sweater snug on his shoulders, a Christmas gift from his daughter. She had insisted, "Dad, you don't always have to look like you're heading to a board meeting." She didn't understand. Sometimes, the world needs to see you in uniform before it lets you through the door. The gate agent scanned tickets with the casual efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Her eyes flicked up as Elijah approached, lingering for just a second longer than necessary. "First class is to your left, sir," she said, but there was something in her voice. Polite, controlled, skeptical. Elijah nodded, tipping his boarding pass toward the scanner. "I know." The terminal air felt different once he crossed into the jet bridge. Colder, somehow, like stepping into a space that didn't quite believe he belonged. The first-class cabin stretched out in soft leather and hushed conversations. Seat 2A waited for him. Window side, second row. He stowed his carry-on above with the ease of a man who could do it blindfolded. But even as he settled into the seat, Elijah felt it. The weight of eyes. Passengers filed past him into economy. Some barely noticing, others pausing just long enough for curiosity to harden into something else. Elijah didn't flinch under the glances. He had spent his whole life being watched. A flight attendant approached. Her steps were light, smile practiced, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach the corners of her eyes. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" Elijah looked up, brows lifting slightly. "It's 2A." Her eyes dipped toward his sweater, then back to his face. "I understand," she said, still smiling, "but I just need to verify." He handed her the pass without a word. She examined it as if she expected the ink to change beneath her gaze. There it was. The pause. The slight hesitation that spoke louder than anything she might say. Elijah knew that pause. He had met it in hotel lobbies, restaurant entrances, and more than once, even in his own cockpit. The assumption that the space he occupied must have been borrowed, mistaken, or given as a courtesy. She handed back the ticket with a nod, her smile flickering. "Thank you, sir. Enjoy your flight." He let the words settle in the air between them. "I plan to." The businessman across the aisle glanced over, fingers drumming against the edge of his laptop. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Elijah could see the unspoken question hanging there. "How did you end up here?" He looked back toward the window, watching the ground crew below. Outside, no one questioned who loaded the bags. No one paused to ask if the man refueling the plane was supposed to be there. But once you stepped inside the cabin, the rules changed. The engines hummed to life, vibrating beneath his feet as the last passengers settled into their seats. A young boy walking by with his mother glanced toward Elijah and whispered loudly, "Mom, do pilots sit here too?" The mother hushed him, tugging him toward the back. But Elijah smiled. Sometimes, he said quietly. Sometimes they do. The boy grinned, wide-eyed, before disappearing down the aisle. Elijah let out a slow breath, leaning back into the leather seat. The plane hadn't left the ground yet, but the weight of the journey had already begun. Because the first-class seat was easy to buy. But holding it, that was the real turbulence. The plane hadn't taken off, but Elijah could feel the altitude shift. It wasn't the engines or the hum of the cabin lights. It was the silence. That silence you recognize when you've lived long enough to know how the world watches without watching. A flight attendant drifted down the aisle, the heels of her shoes tapping softly against the carpet. She moved with the ease of someone who could serve champagne at 35,000 feet and turbulence in the same breath. Elijah watched her from the corner of his eye. He didn't need to look directly at her to know she'd stop at his row. Sir? Her voice hovered just above a whisper. Elijah set down his book. The same one he hadn't turned a page in since boarding. Yes? Could I see your ticket one more time? She held her clipboard with two hands, knuckles white against the leather binding. Her name tag read Karen. Of course it did. Elijah smiled. A small, quiet smile. Something wrong? Karen glanced around the cabin as if the answer sat somewhere between the rows. Oh no, nothing wrong. I just need to confirm. She cut herself off, but Elijah knew how that sentence ended. That you're supposed to be here. He reached into his pocket, slow and deliberate, producing the ticket as if offering proof of his own existence. The businessman across the aisle shifted uncomfortably, his laptop screen now forgotten. The elderly couple 2 rows ahead stopped their hushed conversation, their eyes drawn to the quiet performance happening just behind them. Karen studied the boarding pass as if it were written in a language she'd only recently learned. I see, she said finally, handing it back. Her smile tightened at the edges. Thank you for your patience. Elijah held the ticket between his fingers for a moment longer, letting the weight of it settle. It's no trouble, he replied, his voice even. I get asked that a lot. Karen's eyes flickered, her posture stiffening as if she'd been caught holding something she wasn't supposed to touch. I'm sure it's just standard procedure, she offered, but Elijah had heard enough procedures in his life to know when one was made up on the spot. She lingered longer than necessary, but when Karen finally left, Elijah let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The businessman cleared his throat. You fly often? Elijah turned toward him, recognizing the clumsy attempt to smooth over the rough edges of the moment. I do, Elijah answered simply. A pause. Pilot. Actually. The businessman's eyebrows lifted, surprise flickering across his face like a light switch that had been left off for too long. Oh, he said, sitting up straighter. That's impressive. Elijah nodded, the smile returning to his lips but not his eyes. It is. The man opened his mouth to say something else, but the words didn't come. Instead, he offered a faint chuckle, returning to the comfort of his laptop screen. Elijah could feel him processing it, fitting the information into a box that hadn't been there before. Pilot. Not passenger. Not stranger. Pilot. But the thing about boxes is they aren't built for comfort. They're built for containment. And Elijah knew. Even pilots had to prove they belonged outside of them. He watched the city shrink beneath the plane's wing as they took off. The lights below flickering like distant memories. Above the clouds, the world was soft and quiet. But the turbulence you can't see is often the hardest to navigate. Elijah glanced at the empty seat beside him, stretching out his legs as the cabin lights dimmed. He'd fought bigger storms than this. And yet, the smallest reminders always seemed to weigh the most. Elijah Cole watched the clouds slide beneath the wingtip, thin and fragile against the weight of the plane. From this height, the earth below looked small. Its boundaries invisible, its divisions smoothed out by distance. But Elijah knew better. The higher you climbed, the sharper the edges became. A soft chime echoed through the cabin. Dinner service. The same flight attendant, Karen, reappeared, moving quietly between the rows, her steps careful and measured. Elijah tracked her progress without meaning to. She hadn't stopped at anyone else's seat twice. Just his. When she finally approached, her smile returned, practiced, polite. Would you care for something to drink? Sir? There it was again. Sir. A word that seemed to balance on the edge of its meaning. Never quite settling in the space between them. Elijah set his book down. Just water. Karen nodded, disappearing down the aisle without another word. It wasn't the kind of tension that demanded attention. No raised voices. No outright defiance. Just the quiet hum of something that didn't belong but refused to leave. Elijah had flown through storms more obvious than this one. Storms that rattled windows and bent metal. But these were the kinds of clouds you could drown in without ever seeing the rain. The businessman across the aisle shifted again, his gaze flicking over as if pulled by the silence. You said you're a pilot? Elijah glanced at him. I did. The man hesitated, fingers tapping against the rim of his glass. Commercial? Elijah smiled faintly, recognizing the shape of the conversation long before it unfolded. 23 years. A pause. Captain. The man let out a short breath, sitting back against his seat. Well, I guess that explains it. Elijah lifted a brow. Explain what? The businessman gestured vaguely toward the aisle. Why was she so thorough? There it was. The unspoken thing, tugged out into the open like a net that had been sitting just beneath the waterline. Elijah let the moment stretch, watching the man squirm under the weight of his own words. Maybe, Elijah said finally, or maybe she wasn't expecting me to be sitting here in the first place. The man blinked. Well, he started, offering an awkward chuckle. I'm sure she didn't mean anything by it. Elijah smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. That's the funny thing about meaning, he said softly. It doesn't have to be loud to make itself known. The businessman nodded slowly, as if agreeing with something he hadn't fully understood. And maybe that was the point. People didn't have to understand it to know it existed. The flight attendant returned, a glass of water trembling slightly in her hand as she set it down on Elijah's tray. Her eyes darted away, as if afraid to meet him directly. Elijah thanked her, his voice calm and steady. The kind of calm that comes from knowing how to fly through turbulence without losing control. The cabin lights dimmed as passengers settled in for the long stretch of flight. But Elijah stayed awake. He'd been flying too long to believe that smooth skies meant the storm had passed. Because sometimes the quietest battles happened at cruising altitude. And no one knew how long the air would hold before the weight of it all came crashing down. The cabin had settled into the soft hum of mid-flight. Tray tables folded away, shades drawn halfway down the windows. Elijah Cole let his eyes drift toward the horizon, where the sky split itself into layers, blue melting into orange, then dissolving into nothing at all. From this height, everything felt distant, but Elijah knew the world never truly disappeared beneath the clouds. You carried it with you. Even up here. A low murmur pulled him back into the cabin. 2 rows ahead, the elderly couple whispered to each other, their voices barely audible over the engines. The businessman across the aisle had fallen asleep, his head tilted awkwardly against the window. For a moment, everything seemed still. Then Karen appeared again. She wasn't carrying drinks this time, just moving slowly down the aisle, eyes sweeping across the rows as if she were counting something no one else could see. When her gaze settled on Elijah, she paused. Excuse me, sir, she said, her voice just loud enough to press into the quiet. Elijah closed his book without marking the page. Yes? Karen hesitated, shifting her weight to one side. I was wondering if you might be more comfortable in the exit row. She offered. It has a little more space. A little more legroom. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Elijah could feel the question hanging in the space between them. It wasn't about comfort. It was about distance. He glanced at the empty seat beside him. The clean stretch of leather untouched by anyone's shadow. I'm comfortable here, Elijah replied evenly. Karen's expression flickered. Just for a second, but Elijah caught it. That slight tightening at the corners of her mouth. The brief flash of something that couldn't quite hide itself behind professionalism. Of course, she said softly, nodding as if she'd anticipated the answer all along. But Elijah knew she hadn't. Because his presence was never part of the design. She lingered for another breath. Long enough for the businessman to stir lightly in his sleep. Then she moved on, disappearing behind the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the plane. Elijah leaned back, letting his head press against the seat. The leather was soft, but the weight in his chest hadn't eased. It never did. The elderly woman in front of him shifted slightly, turning her head just enough to catch Elijah's eye. Her gaze held something unspoken, sympathy. Perhaps. Or maybe curiosity. Elijah couldn't tell the difference anymore. Traveling far? She asked. Her voice polite but hesitant. Elijah smiled faintly, recognizing the rhythm of the conversation before it began. Just home, he answered. It's been a long week. Her husband, seated beside her, glanced over his shoulder. Pilot, isn't that right? The man asked. Elijah nodded. Captain. The woman's eyes softened, the lines around them easing into something closer to relief. That explains it, she said, as if the title alone made sense of everything. It didn't. But Elijah let her believe it did. Because he knew people needed reasons for things that didn't sit right. And when the reasons didn't exist, they built them out of whatever scraps they could find. The man smiled, offering a nod of approval. Must feel good to relax on the other side of the cockpit for once. Elijah's fingers tightened around the edge of his armrest. But his smile didn't falter. It's different, he replied. That was the closest he could come to the truth. The woman watched him for a moment longer, then turned back in her seat. Satisfied by the exchange, Elijah watched the clouds stretch out endlessly beneath them, feeling the stillness return. But silence was rarely empty. It filled itself with questions unasked, judgments unspoken. He'd flown through storms that bent steel and cracked the sky open. But those storms passed. This one lingered. A soft ding signaled the seatbelt light. But Elijah didn't move, because sometimes, the turbulence wasn't in the air. It was quiet. And up here, at 35,000 feet, the quiet had nowhere else to go. The sky outside stretched endlessly, pale blue dissolving into the edges of the horizon. Elijah Cole sat still in seat 2A, his book unopened, his eyes drifting over the clouds below. You'd think, by now, the world would feel smaller from this height. But it didn't. It felt further away. The curtain that separated first class from the rest of the plane rustled faintly as Karen passed through. Careful not to meet his eyes, Elijah watched her reflection in the glass. Even when people looked away, they left shadows behind. A soft voice broke the stillness. Excuse me, sir? Elijah turned, finding another flight attendant standing at his row. Younger, nervous. Her name tag read Sarah. She held a clipboard in her hands, gripping it tightly as if afraid it might float away. I'm sorry to disturb you, she began, shifting awkwardly, but we're just doing a routine check. Her words stumbled over themselves, and Elijah raised a brow. A check? Sarah nodded too quickly. Yes, sir. For seating assignments. Just to make sure everything's in order. Elijah said nothing for a moment, letting the weight of her explanation settle into the quiet space between them. Is that right? He asked finally. Sarah's smile faltered. I'll just need to see your ticket one more time. Elijah had been mistaken for many things in his life. Lost. Confused. Invisible. But never a man who didn't know where he was sitting. He didn't reach for his ticket right away. Instead, he leaned back, tapping his fingers lightly against the armrest. Tell me something, Sarah. She blinked, clearly unprepared for anything outside the usual script. Sir? Elijah's voice stayed calm, but his words cut clean. How many times do you check tickets in first class? Sarah opened her mouth, but the answer never came. Because they both knew the truth. Once. Unless someone like Elijah was sitting there. He held her gaze, letting her sit with that realization for just a little longer than was comfortable. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket, pulling out the boarding pass. Sarah took it with careful hands, scanning it even though she already knew what it said. 2A, first class. When she handed it back, her grip trembled slightly. Thank you, sir, she murmured, stepping back as if retreating from something heavier than she could carry. Elijah tucked the ticket away. But the thing about tickets is they only prove where you are, not why you're questioned for being there. Sarah disappeared down the aisle, Her footsteps quick. The businessman across from Elijah glanced over, his eyes flicking away just as fast. Funny how people watched without watching. Elijah returned his gaze to the window. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the sky. And somehow, the plane felt higher, not because of altitude, but because of distance. He had spent his career watching the world from above, guiding planes through storms that cracked the heavens open. But even up here, the air was thinner when you weren't expected to stay. A soft chime signaled the captain's voice overhead, announcing their descent. Elijah exhaled, feeling the weight shift in his chest. Down below, the world waited, and Elijah knew, when the wheels touched the ground, the questions wouldn't stop, because sometimes, it wasn't about the flight. It was about the landing. The wheels of the plane kissed the air, and for a moment, Elijah Cole could feel the world holding its breath. The hum of the engines softened, but the silence that followed carried a weight he knew too well. It wasn't the kind of silence that asked for peace. It was the kind that waited for proof. Sarah, the young flight attendant, returned down the aisle. She didn't stop at Elijah's row this time. Her eyes flicked past him, like a man driving past a house he knows he shouldn't stare at too long. Elijah watched her pass without saying a word. Because up here, at 35,000 feet, a man could disappear right in front of you. And if no one said his name aloud, they could pretend he was never there at all. The elderly woman 2 rows ahead whispered to her husband, glancing over her shoulder as if Elijah couldn't see her. He smiled faintly to himself. It was always the whispers that carried furthest. The businessman across the aisle shifted uncomfortably. He had been pretending to read the same page of his magazine for the last 15 minutes. Elijah could feel the questions simmering beneath his skin. Ones the man didn't know how to ask without revealing too much of himself in the process. Pilot, huh? The words slipped out, unsteady but curious. Elijah nodded, folding his hands over his lap. 23 years, he answered simply. The man let out a low whistle, as if Elijah had told him something far more unbelievable. Didn't expect that, the man muttered, eyes darting back to his magazine. Elijah watched him carefully. Why not? The man hesitated, flipping the page without reading it. Guess I thought you'd, I don't know, dress the part. His voice trailed off, swallowed by his own discomfort. Elijah smiled, but there was no warmth in it. That's the thing about uniforms, Elijah said quietly. They only tell you who a man is after you've already decided who he isn't. The businessman's eyes flicked toward the curtain separating first class from the rest of the plane. You get questioned a lot? Elijah shrugged. Enough to know the difference between a question and an accusation. The man exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Well, guess it's just a misunderstanding, he offered, his voice light. Elijah nodded slowly. It always is. The conversation could have ended there. But Elijah let the words hang between them, long enough for the man to hear his own silence. Karen reappeared, weaving through the aisle with refills of coffee. When she reached Elijah's row, she hesitated, the pot trembling slightly in her hand. More coffee, sir? Her voice had softened, almost apologetic. Elijah met her eyes. He thought about letting her squirm under the weight of the question, thought about answering her the way the world so often answered him. With hesitation. But Elijah wasn't built that way. No, he said gently. I'm fine. Karen nodded, her relief almost palpable as she disappeared toward the galley. The businessman watched the exchange with quiet curiosity. After a long pause, he leaned in slightly. Do you ever get tired of it? Elijah raised a brow. Tired of what? The man hesitated, struggling to find the right words. You know, having to explain yourself. Elijah chuckled softly, shaking his head. You assume I ever stop. The plane began its descent, the ground pulling closer with each mile. Outside the window, the city lights flickered too far away to touch, but bright enough to remind Elijah of where he was headed. The businessman cleared his throat again. Listen, he said, shifting uncomfortably. I probably should have said something earlier. When she checked your ticket the second time. I mean, Elijah glanced at him, his expression unreadable. You should have, Elijah replied simply. The man nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. I didn't know what to say, he admitted. Elijah smiled faintly, watching the man stumble over his good intentions. You didn't have to say anything, Elijah said, leaning back in his seat. You just had to stand in the space between right and wrong long enough to make room for someone else. The plane landed with a soft thud, the wheels skimming the tarmac like a breath being released. Passengers stirred, gathering their things, already preparing to leave the moment behind. But Elijah sat still, watching as they filed past him, eyes fixed on the ground. Some moments didn't stay in the air. They followed you home. The plane idled on the tarmac. But no one was in a rush to leave. There's a strange thing that happens at the end of a flight. People forget they're still moving. Even after the wheels kiss the ground. The air hums with the weight of the journey they carried with them. Elijah Cole could feel it pressing against his chest. He stayed seated as the aisle filled with the polite shuffle of passengers gathering their things. Sarah, the younger flight attendant, lingered near the front of the cabin, her eyes skimming over Elijah like a pebble skipping across water, touching, but not daring to sink. Karen stood near the galley, her back stiff as she poured coffee for no one in particular. The businessman across the aisle avoided Elijah's gaze altogether. The curtain separating first class from economy fluttered faintly, parting just long enough for Elijah to catch a glimpse of the crowded rows behind it. There were no empty seats back there. No one asked to see tickets twice. He leaned back, resting his hand on the armrest, tracing his fingers along the cool leather. For most people, the flight had ended. For Elijah, it never really did. A voice broke the silence beside him. Sir? Karen's shadow fell across the aisle. Elijah turned his head slowly, raising a brow. Her smile appeared, thin and fragile, the kind you offer when you've just remembered someone's name after forgetting it for too long. I just wanted to apologize for earlier. The businessman glanced up from his magazine but quickly looked away again. It wasn't his apology to witness. And yet, he couldn't stop listening. Elijah nodded once. Karen shifted nervously, gripping the tray in her hands as if it might hold her steady. I didn't realize. She trailed off, letting the sentence dissolve between them. Elijah waited. But Karen never finished. She didn't have to. Because Elijah had heard that silence before. You didn't realize who I was, Elijah said softly, finishing the thought for her. Karen swallowed, her grip tightening around the tray. No, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't. Elijah met her gaze, holding it gently but firmly. And that's the point, isn't it? Karen opened her mouth, but no words came. Because what do you say to a man who already knows the answer? Elijah let the silence hang there a little longer. Long enough for it to become something she would remember the next time she saw someone who didn't look like they belonged. Finally, he spoke. I've been flying for more than 2 decades. Elijah said quietly. Planes don't care who you are. They rise just the same. Karen nodded, but the apology still lingered on the edges of her lips. Elijah could see it. The weight she wanted to set down but didn't know how. So he gave her something to hold onto instead. I'll tell you something my mother told me, Elijah said, leaning forward slightly. Karen's eyes widened, caught off guard by the shift. She said, the world will always ask you to explain why you're sitting at the table. But never forget. You pulled up that chair yourself. Karen's shoulders eased, the faintest trace of relief crossing her face. Thank you, she whispered, stepping back toward the galley. The businessman across the aisle exhaled, folding his magazine shut. That was something, he muttered. Elijah smiled faintly, watching as Karen disappeared behind the curtain. It usually is. Passengers began filing out, their heads ducked low as they moved past Elijah's row. Some nodded politely, others pretended not to see him at all. But Elijah didn't mind. It wasn't their apology to give. The businessman lingered, standing near his seat, tapping his wedding ring against the metal buckle of his carry-on bag. Finally, he spoke. Captain Cole, he began carefully. I hope this doesn't come out wrong. But, you handled that with a lot more patience than I would have. Elijah chuckled softly. That's the thing about patience, he said. People mistake it for grace. The man furrowed his brow. What's the difference? Elijah met his gaze. Grace is something you offer freely. He explained. Patience is what you hold when you're too tired to keep explaining why you belong. The businessman's lips parted slightly. But no words followed. Elijah watched him fumble with his bag for a moment. Then step into the aisle. Before he left, he paused. If you ever fly this route again, the man said, I hope I see you up there in the cockpit. Elijah smiled. I've probably flown you already. He replied. You just didn't know it. As the plane emptied, Elijah sat back, feeling the weight in his chest begin to lift. The apology Karen had offered wasn't new. But every time someone spoke it aloud, it chipped away at the silence. And that, Elijah thought, was a kind of victory all its own. The last of the passengers filtered out, leaving Elijah alone in the soft glow of the cabin lights. He closed his eyes briefly, listening to the quiet hum of the engines cooling beneath the floor. Because some flights never truly end. They stay with you. And even at 35,000 feet, the world finds its way into your seat. The final shuffle of footsteps faded into the jet bridge. Elijah Cole sat alone in seat 2A. The hum of the engines winding down beneath him. The cabin, now empty, felt larger somehow, like a room that remembered too much. Karen reappeared, lingering near the front of the cabin. She wasn't holding coffee this time. Her hands were empty. Elijah. His name hung in the air, spoken without the insulation of, sir, or, captain. It landed softer than before. But not without weight. I wanted to thank you, she said, her voice quiet, for your understanding earlier. Elijah glanced up from his lap, studying the edges of her face. Karen wasn't young, but there was something in her eyes that reminded him of green pilots. People who had logged the hours but still held on to the belief that the air would always be smooth. He let the silence stretch between them, filling the space she was too careful to occupy. Understanding, Elijah repeated, as if testing the word on his tongue. His voice carried the same calm tone he used when storms rattled the cockpit, steady but unflinching. Karen shifted her weight, her eyes flicking toward the galley, as if searching for something that wasn't there. She started, but Elijah raised a hand gently, cutting her off. You don't have to explain, he said. I know how the sky works. Karen blinked, unsure if he was speaking about the flight or something else entirely. Elijah meant both. She took a step closer, her voice dipping low, as if confessing something sacred. I didn't mean to. She hesitated, the apology stumbling before it could take shape. But Elijah had heard it before. In different airports. At different tables. In different rooms where he was the only shadow in a sea of light. Karen, Elijah said softly, meeting her gaze. You didn't mean to. But that doesn't mean it didn't happen. Her shoulders stiffened at the quiet truth of it. Elijah watched the words sink in. The way they always did when people realized their intentions couldn't unmake the damage already done. I suppose she began. But Elijah leaned forward, folding his hands over his knees. Let me ask you something. He interrupted. Karen's lips pressed together, nodding for him to continue. If I wasn't a pilot, Elijah said, if I wasn't Captain Cole, would this conversation be happening at all? Her face tightened, as if the question had walked right up to the part of herself she hadn't looked at in a long time. I don't know, she admitted. Elijah smiled faintly. I do. Karen's shoulders lowered, the weight of his words settling between them. The cabin, for all its empty seats, felt crowded with unspoken truths. I'll do better, Karen said after a long pause. Her voice was soft but certain. I mean it, Elijah nodded, but his eyes drifted past her, out the window where the wings stretched long into the fading light. Good, he said, because the next person who sits in this seat might not be a pilot. Karen's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to respond but thought better of it. She nodded, stepping back toward the galley. As Elijah gathered his things, he felt the plane tip slightly underfoot, a reminder that, even on solid ground, the balance could shift without warning. By the time he stepped off the plane, the airport was alive with movement, passengers rushing to catch connections, families reuniting near baggage claim, voices rising and falling like the tide. Elijah walked through the crowd, unnoticed now. No one asked for his ticket. No one questioned where he belonged. But the weight of 2A lingered. Because Elijah knew. Some seats carried more than just passengers. A text from his daughter flashed across his phone screen. "You home yet?" Elijah smiled, his thumbs moving quickly over the keys. Almost. He looked up, watching the people drift past him, each carrying their own stories. Most of them would never know the shape of this one. And that, Elijah thought, was why it mattered so much. When the plane lands, the sky doesn't disappear. It stays waiting for the next flight. Waiting for the next person to take a seat and wonder if they'll have to explain why they deserve to be there. Elijah stepped outside, the evening air wrapping around him like an old jacket. The city stretched ahead, loud, restless, and unapologetically alive. He tightened his grip on his bag, knowing tomorrow he'd return to the cockpit. Because even at 35,000 feet, the ground is never far behind.